I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker. It's not very often that you have a vision and find someone who completely captures the essence of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. I think it was about a year ago that I came across an article online and learned of whole worker organizing power in power structure analysis. Everything she wrote of seemed fresh and cutting edge. It was sophisticated, yet also applicable to everything that we're trying to accomplish here. Much of her theory was not far from her own vision of building a member-driven union, and I immediately went out and purchased every one of her books. I then emailed her to see if there might be a chance that she would come speak at an upcoming event. I'll be honest with you, I didn't think I'd get a response because of the caliber of person that Jane is and how busy she is. But as my wife likes to say, asking is free. My wife is pretty smart, and the next thing I know, we're going through the whole worldwide organizing for power training and booking her to be with us today. She has a new book that just came out, Rules to Win By, that I can't wait to dive into. Please join me in welcoming Jane McAlevey, organizer, author, and scholar. Appreciate you being here, Jane.
I am so excited to be here. And I love that story, Michael Hines. I am really excited to be here. And the truth is, there's nothing more important to me than spending my time with unions, local unions, provincial unions, if it's a different country, a national union, doesn't really matter to me. Any place where there's a group of workers who are trying to figure out how to win and how we get some justice is a place that I want to spend my time. And so it's been a pleasure, sort of in this virtual space we're in, to get to know your local just a little bit through Organizing for Power, through the organizing course, and looking at the evaluations each week as I do, and seeing whether things are resonating or not. So I'm very, very excited to be here today. And what we're going to do is and thanks for the patience of dealing with our slides. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so right now and walk through the themes of the new book. And I'm honored and delighted that, Michael, that you've got the previous ones. They are all of the same theme, which is how do we put workers, it's all of you, at the center of building stronger unions so that we can get some real justice from some companies that are frankly ravaging you and your families and everybody in this country right now. So I'm going to run through the slides for about 40 minutes, make up a little time, and then we're going to have, I hope, a robust question and answer period and some real discussion about this work. So the title of this is Building High Participation Unions Through Negotiations, which may be a little bit counterintuitive until I run you through some of the core principles that are in the new book. I'll be cheat sheeting you a little bit through the new book right now, but I find by telling stories about how I've helped workers win really great contracts, that's probably the best way to do the teaching. So let's just get rolling here. I should just say, in addition to the nice words that Michael said, I am the daughter of a politician, a World War II fighter pilot turned politician. And those are all symbols of things that were around my house as a young girl growing up. And that's actually me in the car auto bumper sticker at the bottom of that screen as a little girl, campaign prop that I was. But in addition to being a campaign prop, what I learned very early in life was that for us to win justice, we had to be well organized. My house is filled with trade union leaders flip charting their way to putting my father into office multiple times. And he, in turn, was then flip charting with them about how to make private sector employers behave anywhere near as good as he was treating employees through the government that he ran in New York. So this is like my life preoccupation. We boycotted everything, and a lot of progressive policy happened in the era when he was running parts of New York State. 4 books, there they are. Who cares, really? Except what I like to say about them is it's only in the last 10 years that I've written these 4 books. And for the 25 years before that, I did nothing really but run campaigns. And I'm still running them. But almost everything I've learned that I'm going to share with you today came either from my mentors or it came from brilliant workers in campaigns. So just as a quick reminder point, we know that the way that the CEOs and the company and corporate leaders, we know the reason that you and your families and most workers in this country are struggling is because the CEOs and the bosses, what we sometimes call the 1%, they divide us. They divide every worker from every worker at every level they can. Black from white, native born from immigrant, Latino from Black, woman from man, you fill it in, right? And the employers wake up every day to divide us, every day. Now they've got a mega merger proposal, which would probably sow division between people. Should we have the merger? Should we not? At the end of the day, it's about union busting. And it's about whether it's Albertsons and Kroger's or whether it's anyone else. It's about mega mergers that eliminate jobs, that put more downward pressure on your lives, your wages, and everything else. So the question is, what is it that you can do? What is it that we can do to overcome the kind of corporate power that exists in Washington State, Puget Sound, New York, California, and every place else I've looked right now in the world. And there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot you're already doing. But we know that for our side to win, for everyday workers to win, we have one strategic power only over that 1% who try to control our lives in bad ways every day. And that is that our strategic advantage is that there's more of us. There are flat out more workers than there are CEOs and bosses, right? And shareholders of corporations. And so we hear the expression a lot, the 99% versus the 1%. And I have to say to all of you that that's a slogan that almost annoys me. In fact, it often annoys me because, you go to a protest and we hear like, oh, the 99% versus the 1%. And while it's true, it's not true unless our large numbers are well organized and then mobilized. And there's a difference between the two, right? Well organized means that we're out there trying to bring new, not yet organized, not yet covered by collective bargaining or a union contract, shops, food processing, warehousing, grocery stores, whatever it is. We're trying to bring more and more of them that don't yet have a union into our fold. That's a part of what organizing is. And it's also a focus on how do we get the people already in our union really functioning and participating in the organization. Then we can mobilize, right? Once we've got a majority of workers in your union actually really engaging with us, then we can mobilize people to get ready for contracts and more. And part of what I want to share with you today is that in my lifetime in the trade union movement, though my mentors taught me all the principles of basic organizing when I became a negotiator, which is now a long time ago, earlier part of this century. I'd been organizing for a while and then finally began to do negotiations. And though I come from a union where there was a belief that everyone had the right to be in the room, when I got moved out to what was called right to work states in the southwestern United States in the early part of this, same time I was starting to negotiate a lot more contracts, I began to realize that in states where union membership was voluntary, and I went to a union where a lot of members didn't like their union for some very good reasons, by the way, at the time, that the best way I could overcome mistrust, suspicion, and a lack of engagement was by not just opening up the negotiations process, but actually really opening up the negotiations process to the workers covered by the collective agreement. And by the way, to workers who work for the same employers who were not yet in our union. they would soon become members of our union, because what they saw in the contract negotiations process was pretty great, I think, as an experience. So the 99% versus the 1% is relevant, but only if we are first organized and then mobilized. So because I want to talk about how do we think about contract campaigns and negotiations as a way to build the power and engagement of workers, I just want to start on some things that I know that you do the first one of very well, which is contract lineup. Like, how do we line up the contracts in a way that they're really close together, close enough together, that the contract expiration is close enough together, that you all can act as one, whether it's in the local negotiations, distinct from the master contract negotiations, but can you act as one big force? And the best way that we've learned how to do that is by lining up our contracts so they really expire, within a few weeks of each other, ideally a few months of each other. We can be creative at the negotiations table about slowing down or speeding up a little bit. But when I was a young negotiator, my mentors said, the most important thing you have to do is make sure that all of the contracts line up and have an expiration date that's close together. Why? Because what we were just talking about was our only strategic advantage is our large numbers, but that only works if we're operating together, if we're organized and mobilized and united. What I went on to pay even more attention to was not just that our contracts were aligned in a way that allowed all the workers to be going to negotiations across the union at the same time, but increasingly that we would actually just treat, even if it's a different employer, we would treat the entire contract campaign as one, trying to negotiate together against any of the same employers, like all the workers across different stores, all the workers, in my case, against different hospitals or nursing homes or whatever it was, going up against the same employer, but could make a demand to be at a single table together. Never one that employers grant very easily, but that would be our demand, and we would get there eventually. But we couldn't make a demand to negotiate together, since we all had the same basic demands for fairness at work, respect, a decent wage, good health care, enough staff to do the job so we didn't go nuts, so we don't go nuts at work. But you can't run a unified contract campaign or make demands to negotiate together if you're too far apart in terms of your contract expirations. So I was taught that this was the architecture of power, that if all the contracts expired at the same time, that would then allow us to have more power. And I learned to have even more power by running every single contract as one big contract campaign at the same time, and trying to negotiate together. And then, because I had moved to what we call right to work for less states, you're largely unaffected by that so far, though given the current Supreme Court, I wouldn't take a lot of comfort, quite frankly, in that you are not yet in right to work for less conditions, because we don't want to go out there yet. But if we think about the current Supreme Court, they're stripping away our rights practically a month at a time. So certainly a session at a time. So when I began to evolve this idea of like, how can we get maximum worker involvement in the union, not just at contract time, but in between contract time, so that our shops are always strong, I began to think, okay, well, transparency is important, right? Does every worker know what's actually going on during negotiations? The next concept for me was electing very big committees, much bigger than we're used to traditionally in the labor movement. So for me, that meant electing a committee that represented at least one kind of every kind of worker across all shifts, because shift work, a grocery store at midnight or 2 a.m. is different than one at 5 p.m. Same with the warehouse, same with the hospital, right? So every different kind of worker, inclusive of every different shift. So that would be a big negotiations committee in a facility that has a lot of different kinds of workers. And then we would elect alternates as well. And then open, meaning we opened up the entire negotiations process to any existing member of the union covered by the collective bargaining agreement. In fact, not just to members in the right to work state, but any worker who would be covered by the collective bargaining agreement. I thought Negotiations are pretty interesting. In fact, they're really interesting. It's us going up our employer and usually a union busting lawyer, trying to figure out why they can't share more of their profits. So why not help workers understand at a maximal level what it really means to be a union member? The best way I thought to do that was just to start inviting people in large numbers into their own negotiations process. And so I want to walk through what that looks like, and share some of that with you. So I want to just break each of these concepts down a little bit. If I said that the core concepts are transparency, big committees, and an open process, that in my life experience has led to much stronger contracts and much stronger unions at the end of the contract fight in an ongoing way, meaning a stronger political program, more members contributing to the political program, members able to enforce the contract that they win because they really understand the language, because a lot more of them were involved in actually either negotiating it or seeing it be negotiated. And then realizing that the only way that we can enforce our contract is if we keep our union strong, right, in between the negotiations. So to me, I want to walk through transparency, big and open. And then I want to talk about the role of the community, to give a sense of where I'm going to go with this. So the first concept is transparent. And that starts for me with the contract survey itself. And I'm just going to run through a few of these quickly. If we do a contract survey in our unions, which most unions do, and this is what we were really looking at doing the research on the book, most unions said, yes, we do a contract survey. If I asked them in the research for the book, again, different than just my life, my own habits, my own traditions of negotiations, what we found doing the research was unions would say they did them. And I would say, well, are they anonymous or not anonymous? Most unions said they're anonymous. I don't believe in anonymous contract surveys. I think we need to know to every worker what the top issues are for every worker. Confidential, sure, maybe, but not anonymous. And then if we asked unions in doing some of the research for the book, what percent of the workers fill in the contract survey? Most unions couldn't answer that question for us. And if they did, it ranged somewhere from 5% participation to about 25% of all workers eligible would send in the contract survey. And I want you to know that when I go into negotiations, I set a goal of no less than 60%, 60% of all the workers filling in the contract survey, not anonymously, but with their name on it. And in fact, the way it's done, moving on to the second bullet there, and why it would be hard to make it confidential, is the gathering of the survey, the initial contract survey, is a face-to-face conversation. In pandemic times, even though all of you went to work most days of the week, some people didn't, and that meant that they were even doing them online together, but like educators, people who were in the school systems. But I think the best way to start a contract process is to be able to say to ourselves, as well as the employer at some point, look, the issues that we're presenting here at the table come from a majority of the workers. Like a majority of the workers actually filled in this contract survey. So that's a nice thing to be able to say when you're sitting in the negotiations process, that a solid majority of workers picked these priorities. And then the way that we usually start to engage with people is by doing the survey process face-to-face, so that it's a organizing tool that key rank and file leaders by workplace are leading the process of doing the contract surveys with their coworkers at shift change, in the break room, or after work, right? So it's face-to-face, and we're doing it face-to-face because we're trying to build and activate more people to get involved in the union. And part of why I love the negotiations process is because if we're trying to get a more activated, more high participation, more engaged rank and file membership, I think there is no better time than by walking up to a colleague and saying, if you could, hey, our contract's expiring whenever that is. Could be a year from now, could be 2 years from now, depending on how long a contract campaign you want to run. If you could change the rules here tomorrow, what are the first 3 things that you would change in our contract? Like that conversation, I've never had a worker in my life say, I have no opinion. I have no opinion. if I say to them, what are 3 changes you'd want to see in your contract, right? So that's why we say not anonymous, because it's best if you're doing that as a conversation, either a team meeting, group meeting, or a one-on-one conversation. And then before we actually even get to the negotiations table in this tradition of transparent and big and open negotiations, I have never not had workers vote to ratify the demands before we go into negotiations. Not at all just ratifying the contract at the end, but actually ratifying the demands. And part of why I love to do pre-contract negotiation demands ratification is several. One, it's another excuse to engage all of the workers, all the members in the contract negotiations process. And I don't ever want to have a worker say to me, well, I didn't know that we were putting that across the negotiations table, or who made that decision, or why didn't we know? I'm going to put the basic proposals out in big meetings and invite the entire workforce to come vote to ratify them. And in that conversation, I'm also going to say the truth is, you and your coworkers don't really stand a chance of winning a lot of this unless you're engaged at a level of 90%. Like, is there 90% of you acting in unity and solidarity and ready to fight for this contract? Because if these demands matter to you, then the only way you're going to win is if you yourselves are ready to fight for them, right? No smart negotiator, it doesn't matter how smart they are, can win anything that the workers themselves aren't willing to fight for. So that's transparency. And many times I've had people say, well, what if the employer sees our demands right before negotiations? And my attitude is fine. Like, what's a big secret? Like, we're coming for you. We want this much in wages. We want this many more staff so that people are not exhausted, when they leave their shift, whatever it is. If it's close to negotiation starting, it's not like it's a big secret. On my end, it doesn't feel like it's a big secret. Who cares if the employer knows, what our demands are right before we start the negotiations? They're going to see them anyway. So the fourth related concept under transparency that is fundamental when I think about how do we build high participation, strong unions that win really good contracts, is we never agree to gag rules. Most unions do. Most unions sign off on something called ground rules. I talk a lot about this in the new book. And I was trained never to sign a ground rule, an official negotiations ground rule in my life, and I never have, not once in a lot of negotiations. I just say to the employer, you treat us fairly, we'll treat you fairly. We're not going to agree to limit the conversations we have with our members about what's happening in negotiations. So that's a sort of no gag rules rule, fundamental to getting members really engaged in the contract campaign and keeping them engaged. And then really short, simple bulletins. And I make those bulletins mostly just pictures of workers themselves saying what happened in negotiations, picture and quote leaflet. So that's what you see on the left-hand side. That's just a front and back flyer coming out of a big day at negotiations. And you might see that we publish on the bottom right, it actually says our next negotiations date is, and it has the date and the place. And that's because the process was open for all the workers covered by that particular contract. So as I say, most of our members aren't lawyers, so we shouldn't write literature for lawyers. We should just do pictures of workers who are at negotiations saying, how did the boss behave today? What was the discussion at the table today? Really brings people to realize that contract talks are whether or not you can build the power and all get unified to win the kind of contract that you want. And then what do I mean by big? When I say electing big committees, there's about 135 workers in the room with me that day, many years ago, in negotiations in Nevada, in a right to work state, where I first began to do very big committees and very big rooms filled with workers. Again, only workers whose contract it is. But that's a nice example of the negotiations room. When I lead negotiations, there can be 400 or 500 workers in the room at this point when I'm leading negotiations. And we'll talk about some of the ways that things stay united and calm and smooth, even with that many workers in the room. But I got to the point in my life where I actually set a goal of having every worker show up at least once just to watch what was going on in their own negotiations, and not show up for 8 hours or 12 hours or 16 hours or 5 hours even, but show up for an hour at shift change. Show up for an hour on your day off. Because my life experience is once a worker even gets in that room and just sees what's happening, it changes their entire worldview of what it means to be a union member. And so I could show you a lot of pictures, but I think you get a sense of it. Now, how do things stay under control, you might ask, when there are hundreds of workers in the room and very large committees? And I will say that discipline is pretty key to the process. And it only works if everyone agrees to these 3 rules. So there's something called the 3 rules of the room when management is present. The first is poker face, show no expression. The first thing you're taught as a negotiator. So if you're going to bring a lot of workers in the room, we have to explain to everyone why we never want the employer to know if we're mad or happy, either one. We just want them to do their job of negotiating with us, right? So keeping a poker face is super important, a neutral face. The second rule, when there's a ton of workers in the room and management's there, right? The key is this is when management's present, is nobody speaks except the chief negotiator unless it's planned. And I have to say, there's a lot of workers who speak when I do negotiations, and it's also quite highly planned. Like we practice it at caucus time. Sometimes it's obvious, I might say to management, we're going to have a presentation by 6 workers about a safety issue that apparently you all don't think is a safety issue. So I might pre-announce it. And sometimes we won't. We'll do a little theater. Like we'll have 4 workers ready to say something that might even look like they're having a bit of a talking out of school when in fact they're not. If we want to play crazy some days near the end of negotiations. So, and then the third key to having a room stay so you can hear a pin drop with a ton of members in the house is sending notes to the negotiator anytime. And I mean anytime. If a worker has something to say or wants to fact check what a manager just said, or the union busting lawyer, or even sometimes me, fact check me, right? Maybe I said something wrong about some work process. Doesn't happen that often, but it could happen. And the key is this is all about participation. Everything is about participation. So we'll put like small pens, small pencils, like golf, I don't know, little baby pencils that are cheap. We'll put a ton of pencils and then index cards on every chair in every room just to drill home. Feel free to pass a note anytime. And I have literally had probably 100 workers at once, all at the same time, pick up an index card, pick up a pen or a pencil, start writing a note and start passing it around those huge tables that you saw. And management knows right then they're in trouble. And I've actually had like chief financial officers like lose their mind watching workers silently passing notes that are coming to me, and I'm reading like 1 note at a time. And when 100 workers do it at once, and the boss knows they just said something really bad and wrong and they're lying, and we're about to bust them, right? So, but that helps from people wanting to feel like they want to talk because they just will pass notes, in this case to me or to whoever the negotiator is. We always set the tone for negotiations by having a big opening presentation where if I'm the chief negotiator, I say nothing. I just introduce the workers and tell management there's going to be a big opening presentation about the demands and the proposals. And if we've pre-ratified them in a vote, the boss might even have the contract in their hands. That's okay with me. Again, we got to go win it, right? So it's a key early step in the process of letting management know that these negotiations will be different than we might have done in the past, or that most of them are used to. Which is that, and we practice first, but there'll be a big presentation by a ton of workers about what the demands are in these negotiations. And then because it seems to me that we endlessly want a way to involve more and more people in the union, and the best way, I argue, is through the contract campaign process, I began to evolve to create something called article committees, by which I mean every article of the contract has a committee of workers who are most interested in that article. Young workers tend to think about having babies in the healthcare plan. Our more mature workers, seniority-wise, tend to think about retirement plans more. Everyone thinks about wages, but you all know every worker has a different set of priorities about what's going to make their life better. Maybe their manager is horrible or racist or sexist or who knows what. Maybe the vacation scheduling is horrific or non-existent, whatever it is. Different workers will be attracted to different issues in the contract. So I realized at some point, probably halfway through my life negotiating, I could just create a committee and any worker who wanted could be on that committee. And the article committees are always chaired by an elected member of the actual negotiations team. So there is one worker leader who holds the major binder, the negotiations binder, on each article in the contract. But this is an example of a bunch of workers sitting around in a caucus during negotiations. And they're saving me a lot of time as chief negotiator because they're reading what the employer put across the negotiations table. And they're going to quickly fact check, did they change anything? Did they give us anything? Are they trying to take something away in that part of the contract? And the beauty of this is that I can have 8 or 9 groups of workers doing that all at once in a big room and simply coming to me when it's time to actually write the counter language. I'm going to invite them to get up and talk to the rest of the workers in the room and say, we're in favor of this language. We're not in favor of this language. Here's why. And the result of this is huge involvement by workers in the contract. There's another result, which is I've really never had a worker say to me, I didn't know that language was going to be in the contract, because we create endless space for workers to actually know what's going to be in their contract, not just know, but fight like crazy for it. Right. So, and this is what the burden is on an organizer's approach to negotiations is we have to create something called article checklists so that when workers do show up to watch their own negotiations quietly, following the 3 rules of the room, if they don't know what's going on, it's going to be pretty boring. Like, would you want to go just watch something and you had no idea what was going on? Probably not. So it means that each contract, I create something called the article checklist. And you can see, Article 1, union recognition. Well, there's some workers on that. Carolyn, John, Pat, Patsy, Sheila, and Fiola. But if you look down at the article on holidays or Article 12 on the bottom right, health, welfare, and pension, you're going to see a lot more workers on that committee, because a lot more workers actually want to fight over what's in the healthcare plan and the pension plan or the retirement plan. But what it means is the columns on this checklist are the article name, what our proposal was is the next column, and on what date we made it, management's counter proposal, and on what date they made it. If it's grayed in, we've got a tentative agreement on it already and we've moved on. That's what a gray one is. But every worker coming in can see, oh, there's been a lot of back and forth about this article in the contract. And they can look through and flip and see exactly what the current language is that we're negotiating over. So having article checklists is a way to make sure that when someone walks in the room, they're not bored. And for any of you who had taken the Organizing for Power course that Michael Hines referenced in the beginning, for me, every aspect of the contract process is what we call a structure test, by which we mean, is the structure store by store? In your case, I'll just say grocery store by grocery store. Is the workplace structure in each store strong enough to win the kind of demands that you're making? Specifically, are 90% of the workers engaging? Like, did 90% fill in the contract survey? That's a high bar for the contract survey. 60% is a good bar, because then we want to start working up from 60% to higher percentage of workers participating in each and every store as we think about the contract process itself. And now I want to move into like the last key component of this, which is how do we get ahead of the bosses and build really big community support into the contract fight? And then I'm going to stop and look forward to having some discussion about this. But if I asked you, if I could see all of you, which I can't just because of the screen, I would say, where are we in those pictures? In that picture, In that picture, like literally what kind of room is that? And you can probably guess if you're staring at it that it's a church of some kind, right? You can see the big things that connect to the organ on the wall. And so once each grocery store in your case, or nursing home or school or childcare center or taxi cab, whatever, I've done negotiations with many, many, many types of workers in my lifetime. But once each store in your case is strong enough, I'm going to say like 70% of people are engaging and participating of the workers are engaging in a petition that we support our negotiating committee. That's what that one basically said. We support our negotiating committee. We were halfway through. Boss was dragging their feet. We wanted to move. So that's actually 5,500 and something signatures out of 8,000 workers. And it took a long time to get those signatures, too long, as I told the workers. We had to get faster and better, which they did, and we all did. But so once we get to like 70% of workers are engaged in the contract campaign process, that's about the time that I think it's right to start making a plan to get community support and engage the community. Now, you can do it ahead of time, but the reason I like to wait is twofold. Even though I project it when I'm talking with all the worker leaders, look, at some point we're going to have to do a big community campaign because you know the employers are going to fight us as long and hard as they can. But I say to all workers up front, we're not going to do the community support work until our work site is strong, until your work site is strong. Again, two reasons. One, we're not going to win. If there isn't ultimately a credible strike threat, which is why we're going to try and go from a 60% contract survey engagement to a 70% firsthand signed petition to an 80% photograph petition or an additional hand signed petition just from among the workers. The reason why we're going to do that is because we're trying to see, you're trying to learn, are you getting close enough to have a really effective strike, which is ultimately your only weapon, right? Your only real weapon against this employer class, whatever the grocery store or whoever the employer is. The only thing that they seem to understand is, can we walk off the job, right? We saw the Colorado UFCW workers do that really effectively last year. So for all of us, it's, can we have a really effective strike? Do we want to have one? No. Can we have one? Does the employer believe that you can have a really effective strike? By which I mean there are no scabs crossing a picket line. All of the structure tests are about that. So there's no point to go ask for community support if we haven't yet gotten ourselves really ready for the kind of fight that we need. So the last thing we do is go build community support. And the second reason is because it takes trust. For example, if I'm going to get ready to say to workers, the way that you can really bring the community into the campaign is if you yourselves do it. Not Jane McAlevey, not Michael Hines, not anyone I know, but each worker has a relationship, a set of relationships of some kind. And workers are different, as we know. So some will have more connections to their community than others. Members with kids tend to have a lot more connections than maybe members whose kids have moved on or they haven't had them yet. If members attend a house of faith, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a temple of some kind. If your kids go to school and they're on sports clubs, right? I always think that is like a ripe place to do community support building in our contract fights. Our kids' schools programs, sports programs, or maybe a sports team that we're on. And there's just parents standing there talking to each other all the time during sports games. And but to me, that's an organizing opportunity. But so all of that work can become to some workers like personal in the beginning when you start to say, so who are all the people that you know in your community? You start a process to map your community together as workers and then make a plan to go ask your community for support letters and to get involved and get ready to support you in a tough contract campaign. That can feel personal at first until you help workers realize nothing personal about, are you going to have enough money to shop at the stores in your local town? Or are you going to have enough funds in your pocket to tithe to the local church or give money to the local mosque or whatever it is? It's not personal at all. So there's several ways that I do this. One is literally by negotiating in the community, never in the employer's facility and never in a fancy conference room, but we will literally choose each location for negotiations based on where the rank and file members have a direct connection in their community. And in this case, it's a very famous Black church in Philadelphia. And when we went through the process of having our members map their community connections, it was clear that we had a few members in this really powerful church, and it seemed like a very good place to hold negotiations. And in fact, of course it was, because most priests and ministers have no idea what a union is at this point in the United States. So to have very powerful faith leaders realize, oh, the union is just a bunch of workers coming in trying to figure out how to have a better life for themselves and their families. Well, that made a lot of sense to this big, powerful Black minister at this church who knew nothing about unions until we invited him in during a lunchtime caucus. And he was like, oh, this is what a union is? It's a bunch of workers trying to have a better life. I'm for this, right? And then he began to mobilize other faith leaders in favor of the workers. So the community mapping, the community charting process that we engage in is this. At some point, once we're already generally in contract talks, it takes about then to get to about 70%, 80% unity and engagement. We look at every single worker and we just draw a map around them and have workers chart themselves, like in one-on-one conversations. Where do your kids go to school? Does your spouse work someplace that maybe has a union already or not, if we want to organize it? Do they belong to a house of faith? Do you belong to a house of faith? Sports team, all these things, local politicians. There's just a ton of who are your immediate neighbors, who do you ride a bus with? There's a ton of ways to begin to chart and map the broader community and look for connections across the members so that when the fight is really on, you can bring your community into the fight. And here's an example of it going from a map, the idea that there's a worker in the middle and workers have connections. And this is a spreadsheet in Excel that came from worker-to-worker conversations about, in this case, where we had members attending houses of faith, which ones. So you can see Fiola in Tower 8 went to Enon Baptist Church. Kevin in Tower 6 went to Rose of Sharon Apostolic Church. So you can go right through this, but in every single campaign where I've done this, which is a lot now, many people at the beginning are quite skeptical, like, our folks don't go to church, maybe some other people do. You'll be surprised. And not just church, but mosque, temple, synagogue, etc. You'll be surprised. And then generally pleasantly surprised if a group of workers go ask for a letter of support, they're probably going to get it because they have a direct relationship to the house of faith where they might be going. And then I'll close it on this, the story of the power of Joyce Rice and doing community campaigns. Joyce Rice, she is still, although I hope she retired this year, a nurse. She's in the middle in that nice red dress. She was a labor and delivery nurse in this particular campaign in Philadelphia, in one of the biggest hospitals in Philadelphia. And this was a unionization campaign. So it was her first contract. And we were at the point where we had done a little power structure analysis, meaning like analyzed outside of the workplace, which churches or which politicians seemed to matter, like who had influence in the city of Philadelphia. So we had researchers working on sort of who had influence. And now we were making a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, to a huge group of workers. And we invited any worker involved in the contract campaign to come to a meeting where we wanted to show them what we understood about people who had power and institutions that had power in Philadelphia, to then get the workers to start doing community mapping together. So we're showing this presentation, and Joyce Rice, labor and delivery nurse, who had birthed, she probably helped carry out the babies of half of the Philadelphia power structure, meaning mayors and city councilors and zoning board people who would decide whether there's a grocery store or not, or a hospital, or everything else they decide, as a labor and delivery nurse. And we're making a PowerPoint presentation about some institutions that we think, if they picked up the mayor, a phone call to the mayor to the city, the mayor would respond. That's one measure of who in the community has power, just one of many. It doesn't take long to do a little research on who has power in any given communities. And so we're showing the results of this analysis to a bunch of workers who have come to a meeting about how to build the community campaign. And this story would repeat itself in my life. It's been repeating itself since the early part of this century. Joyce Rice raised her hand, and I know Joyce from coming to contract campaign meetings and negotiations at that point. And that's what I know about Joyce. She's a good nurse in labor and delivery in a big hospital. She puts her hand up and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry I interrupted Jane, but I just want to say I was looking at the presentation you were making about some of the faith leaders, some of the different churches and houses of faith in Philadelphia. And she said, I wasn't sure, so I wanted to make sure first, but you have the Baptist Pastors and Ministers Alliance of Philadelphia, and you have them pretty high up, like they have some power." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I'm sorry, I was texting. I just wanted to make sure it was true before I spoke up." And she was speaking just like this, very deferential, which is crazy for me. And she said, "But I thought I saw that my minister was elected to be the head minister of that Baptist Pastors and Ministers Coalition of Philadelphia." And so we were just texting a little bit, Jane, and he just said he is the head. He is now the head. Our church is now at the leadership of the Baptist Pastors and Ministers Coalition for the next 2 years. It's a rotating minister who's the leader of it. And he'd love to know what's happening in the contract campaign. Now, if you could have seen me that day, I almost fell over and had a heart attack, because that story is a constant story in my life. Without us asking our own rank and file members, all of you, to map all the connections that you have, it doesn't occur to people to bring their community naturally into their hard-fought contract fight. And I was standing in front of a room of a group of these workers, and I thought, not only is Joyce Rice connected to this super powerful minister, but she's texting him and he's responding. He's the kind of minister that we had already asked people, like if he rang up the mayor of Philadelphia, would he get a meeting and how quickly? Just two of the questions we'll ask. If someone calls the mayor of your city, will they get a phone call back? How quickly will they get a meeting? This guy was assessed at like the highest level of that, this particular minister. And sitting right in the meeting and sitting all this time, 6 months of contract campaign struggle, is the strongest connection humanly possible to that minister. And her name is Joyce Rice. And that's her. And very soon, the contract campaign would go from, we're doing okay, it's kind of a slog, to an entire different level of power, because her minister would go on to write a letter right there on the Baptist Pastors and Ministers Conference of Philadelphia and vicinity. You don't need to see the whole thing. The operable part is, "Dear Barry Friedman," who was the CEO of this big hospital. And he says, the letter says, "As pastor of Rome Emmanuel Baptist Church and president of the Baptist Pastors and Ministers Conference of Philadelphia, blah, 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 to over 100 churches in our group, I'm writing on behalf of and in support of our many members across the city and this vicinity who are employed as nurses at your hospital, ... And he would go on his letterhead, representing 100 powerful churches, to start to take on the CEO of the hospital, along with the workers and all the faith leaders who the workers had met by us rotating negotiations around. And it's not always churches. Could be a soccer club, meaning a football club, could be a basketball club. It could be anything you fill in the blank that matters. A parent-teacher association coming to support workers in the grocery stores, whatever it is. So that is what I want to share with you about what I've learned over the years about how we can use negotiations to get really high rank and file member involvement in the union and sustain it, and win the kind of contracts that you deserve. So that is it. And now I'm looking forward to some discussion and questions and answers with all of you.
That's it? That's all you got?
Yeah, I mean, we could keep going, but that's it for now. Oh, good. I know I can see you all.
That was so awesome. Yeah. So I'll start by asking a question, Jane. I've been around UFCW, and I don't want to call out my own union necessarily, but I've been in the UFCW since the mid-90s when we organized the hospital I worked at. How come I've never heard of this before until your books? And I will say the person I'm interviewing after lunch, Kim Cordova in Colorado, I don't know if you know of her. She very much does open big bargains with these employers. they don't like it at all. So how come other unions aren't doing this?
It's a great question. I did not know that Kim was doing it, but that's fantastic. I can say that Local 770 down in Southern California has started to do this a little bit because they've been taking courses with me for the last couple of years. So they were not even baby stepping and then big stepping into it in the last round at Ralph's and Food for Less. But I think there's several reasons why it's not happening. One, it's a lot of pressure on the chief negotiator, right? Like it's hard. It means that you have different work to do as the negotiator, like typing up those article checklists and stuff. Although at the end of the day, I'm going to argue that time gets knocked out by how efficient it is to have article committees in the room when an employer walks in and drops 8 counter proposals on you at once, and thinks I've literally had them drop 8 at once after not giving us a counter proposal for weeks on end, and then say, oh, we're going to leave now because we know you can't possibly respond to those, 8 counter proposals that we've owed you for the last month or something. And I always say, oh, no, you just go take a caucus, we'll be back soon with some responses. So, because the efficiency, like once we set up the negotiations this way, boy, the efficiency is incredible of workers doing that hard work of reading all the proposals, flagging for me, coming up, discussing it, and then debating with each other. Do they want to accept it or reject it? So, I think it means several things. It really holds leadership to account, right, for the bargaining process. It makes it so that the proverbial deals can't get cut very easily unless, if you got members in the room who are making a demand, it's hard to settle cheaper than we should. Now, part of why, though, Michael, I talked about the ratification ahead of time is because I'm really honest with every single worker, which is, you got all these big proposals, you're not going to win any of them, right? If you don't have a credible strike threat and a community campaign, by the way, both.
Yeah.
So doesn't matter how clever any of your negotiators are, if you aren't ready to fight for it, not just you, but you getting all of your coworkers store by store ready, you're probably not going to stand much of a chance of winning these proposals. So, and that even becomes really validated once the workers are in the room. They sort of realize, oh, it's just some people in a closed room. Like, how's the boss going to know that we're really serious about this? So almost no unions are engaging in negotiations this way. It's a small group of us. And I would argue, as I do argue in the book, we win better contracts. And we win them because we're building stronger unions, because the contract itself becomes a central tool for rebuilding our unions. And it's in the rebuilding of our unions that we stand a chance to win more, right?
Yeah.
But it holds people accountable in ways that they often don't want to be held accountable. And of course, for me, I'm using it to hold the workers themselves accountable. What kind of contract do you want? It's up to you, not me. I can write language to the cows come home. But who's got to win it is you and your coworkers, right? So to me, it's actually transferring accountability to the workers in some very real way about what's going to get won and what's going to get lost in a contract fight.
That's great.
So Jane, first, thank you so much for sharing yourself with us, your experience and your skill. We're just growing from everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
I put in the chat my question, but since you're here, regarding participation, let me find it. Where did I go? Regarding participation, well, I can't find it. What would you tell us for a tool to use when we've lost members, like for instance, in my 200 employees in my store, and we've lost a very influential group of people who were very influential and active for the union. We've lost them due to either, hurt, disgruntlement, anger. We've lost their trust as a union. Could you give us a tool to use what would you do?
This process. I mean, to me, when genuinely, like, when I moved to Nevada, so that was 2000 and beginning of 2004, when I left the comfort of, well, like a Washington State environment, when I left having, like, once workers voted to form a union and once we had a contract, all the members were paying dues. When I left that land and went to where the trade union was voluntary, I got to say the thing I really enjoyed about shifting to a right to work for less state at a young age is you know how the members feel every day because they're paying dues or not. It's a pretty harsh reality. Like, they're paying dues or they're not, right? So, and when I got to that union, we had some shops that had 7% of members in the shop paying dues to the union, 19%, 18%. And I said to all the workers, well, no wonder your contracts stink. I mean, the boss sees that number too, right? Like, this is a place where we have to really rebuild people's members' faith in their own organization. And that is how I came to have all those, well, not all of them, the Philadelphia pictures are more recent ones, but all the early pictures I showed you in that slide deck are all from a right to work for less state, that when I became the executive director of the statewide union, when the executive board hired me in the union, and I said, I'm going to propose some stuff that's going to be pretty radically different than what you've been doing. And the workers said, God, thank God, because they were concession bargaining every contract for the few years prior to when I got there. And not only did we stop concession bargaining, we started winning a lot. But I had very intense debates with the dedicated few who were members of that union for many years. When I proposed that we invite not just the members, but the non-members in each shop into the negotiations process. One battle was with the employer to do that, right? That's its own battle. But I was actually having a pre-battle, which was longtime, very committed worker leaders saying, there's no way, if they're not paying dues, that we're going to let them involved in the contract process. And so I had to, a 25-year younger or something me, I had to look at them and smile and say, how's that working for you? Like, how's that working for us? To, like, keep out the non-members? Is that working to build the union stronger by saying you have to first decide you want to pay dues and get involved in the union, and then we'll let you get involved in your own contract talks, right? And so those were just a lot of really honest, hard conversations, which are the ones I like to have the most with workers all over the world at this point now, which is, you hired me because you're engaging in concession bargaining in every contract. So why don't we try to do something that's actually going to bring alienated workers back to the union? Like, alienated, disgruntled. It's been a really rough pandemic. It's been an extra, can we just acknowledge that? I mean, it's been an extra rough few years for workers in this country and the whole world. So people are pissed and tired and sick of it all. What do you mean I got to go do this? You go figure out the contract, right? That's a very typical response, unless we're prepared to say to them, only way you're going to win a change is actually to get involved. And so when I have disgruntled members, I say that's why we're about to change how we do things here. And there'll be skepticism about that. But nothing meets skepticism like, would you like to come to a contract planning meeting that's wide open? Would you like to be involved in working on the contract campaign and actually voting to make the decisions about what's going to go across the negotiations table? And then when we say, and you yourself can be present in the room, that's usually an internal barrier we have to overcome, like I did in Nevada. But once we did that, we had workers climbing off the rafters to be involved in the negotiations. And these were workers who were, I think you said disgruntled. I'm going to say really hated the union when I got there in Nevada. I mean, they hated their union. They weren't just disgruntled. They thought it was an awful institution and had given up on it. And so it was really using my ability to strategically use the contract bargaining process as a way to rebuild faith in their organization. Like, that's what it came from, was me thinking, I have no other way to do this except to say, you think you got ripped off in the last contract? You think that your union sold you out in your last contract? You think that you haven't been repped well? Get involved and be part of it and come watch and look at it. and then make the decision about who's really hurting you, right? Is it the boss, or is it your coworkers, right? So that's sort of where it comes from, is trying desperate moves to rebuild clusters, whole sections of workers' faith back into their own organization. So,
Thank you,
and
Jane.
it really works in my experience.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone in the room?
I have some, it's more of a comment.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
What I like is when you talked about having people.
I
take
can't
over.
see you. Oh, can you lean in, whoever that is? I almost see you.
Come on, Gina.
Come on, Gina.
That's all right. Hi. Okay.
I've been a long
Thanks.
time. What I liked is that you had people taking over articles, and that's what I actually really like, because I think a lot of our articles have needed to have some adjustments. So mine is more of a comment, more so than a question, that you have people assigned to that, because I think that's something that I really think we do need to do in our contracts, is have people assigned to certain articles to see language updated. So I just like that. I just wanted to make a comment about that. Thank you.
Great.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, it's again, to me, the creation of the article committees, that happened in Nevada as well. It happened in a particularly difficult, like that was probably 2006. Like each little component of this like evolved over time until it became like the 21 in this new book. You'll see the 21 elements of high participation, high power negotiations, and these are just a handful of them. The only thing my mentors taught me, not the only thing, first they taught me how to organize, that period, so that mattered. But when it came to negotiations, all they said was, it's good to have a big committee. Okay, great. It is good to have a big committee. And then I went crazy about every possible way to use every possible thing we do in negotiations to involve the members. And have been rebuilding disengaged workforces one at a time ever since. So, yeah.
On that note, I saw a question in the chat. I can't find it exactly now, but somebody asked, and I'm back here, way back here. But
You can stand up, Patty.
I'm right here. All right.
Thank you.
Somebody was asking about how to beat the severely apathetic membership that we have. Even in our like grocery surveys, we barely got any really compared to the entire membership. So how do we move past that? What are some like steps that we can do to move forward with those? That's good.
Yeah. Nothing I love more than a contract survey. I know that seems a little bit odd, but maybe I am. But I love contract surveys. I love contract time for so many reasons. And I love to start with setting a majority contract survey participation before we'll start negotiations. So the ideal way we're doing it is we are going to work with, even if we've got one worker leader, two worker leaders, we're going to start with what we have at grocery store by grocery store, let's say. And we're going to start by saying, we're going to do something different in this contract campaign. We're going to really involve you and your coworkers in a way that we have not traditionally, because we've learned that Kim Cordova, forget McAlevey, we've learned that in Colorado when they had that great strike and won that great contract, that they were doing this, right? So something that makes even more sense to people than some strange person in New York or California, wherever I am, depending on the day. We've learned that actually this is how workers win more, is by starting by involving you. And then we roll right into the, if you could change 3 things about work tomorrow, what would they be? And then I can't get anywhere with that one worker until I know those issues. You can't get anywhere. Their coworkers can't get anywhere. But once they say, our wages stink, or there's no health and safety protocols, or what happens when the next pandemic hits and we've got grocery bags over our head, or whatever they're going to be asked to do by some out of control employer, once we have that one issue, we're kind of often running with them, right? Because as we know, like the whole conversation is going to evolve from, well, if you want to win I don't know, let's just say 30% raise. I'm just saying that because the school employees, non-teachers just won that in Los Angeles on a strike a week ago. Who thought they'd win their 30% demand when their boss said you would never win 30% in your contract, right? And they just won 30% in that contract fight with the giant strike. So, and a lot of community support, by the way, right, built in. So, I think we explain. And the reason I love to use wall charts, right, grocery store by grocery store, is because we have to really teach what power means. There is no one who's going to teach rank and file workers in your union what power means except for you. We don't learn what power means in school if we went, had the time to go to school. We didn't learn it in elementary school. We didn't learn it in junior high. We might have learned in the United States about something called the Civil Rights Movement and some guy, Martin Luther King or Rose, whatever. But no one really teaches you what power is. And so part of why I love to use the big wall charts that I know some of you were just engaging with in the organizing class is because that's the best way I've learned to help workers work site by work site, unit by unit, shift by shift, know whether or not they have enough power to win what they want. That change that they've said to me early in a conversation that they want, which is to show them, well, look, none of you are participating in anything in the store. And so it's going to be hard for you to win 30% or 20% or 5% or whatever it is, health and safety protocol, whatever the issue is. It's going to be hard for you to win that if no one's participating, because negotiations, it turns out, are just about power. There's nothing else. There's nothing else negotiations are about except power. So can you build enough to force the employer to give you what you want or not? And I always say to people, you could have the smartest chief negotiator in the world. I mean, it helps, but it's not going to win you a great contract. It's what are the workers willing to do to fight for that contract? And how are we, as either staff or elected leaders, how are we enabling the workers to actually come to realize the only way they're going to win a great contract is if they're directly involved in the process themselves? That's my mantra every morning when I wake up is how can I help the workers understand no one's going to save them. No smart chief negotiator can do it. And I'll say a funny story about this in the negotiations that I was just showing you some pictures of in the end in Philadelphia. I forgot. I mean, I forget all the time that I write books because I'm mostly out running campaigns. And I forgot that I was going back into negotiations after pausing and getting a PhD and being out of the field in a direct way for 5 years, right? I was coaching some unions. I was doing organizer training when I was in graduate school, which for me was a vacation. To be honest, I wanted to sleep for 5 years. And so I went back to school, which I'd never graduated from. So, and when I did that, I forgot literally when I came right back in the field, I went straight back into these huge negotiations and this big organizing campaign in Philadelphia. And I walked in the room and I'd been so concerned about getting everyone ready and electing this huge committee and all of the stuff, getting the article checklist right. And I kind of forgot that I already had one book out. At that point, one book was out that says every single thing I do in negotiations as a chief negotiator. That book was Raising Expectations. No shortcuts would come out later. Huh?
I love that book. It's
good.
I have a feeling I might like this one the best, but Raising Expectations was my favorite.
Well, I'm glad you say that. Almost people have hardly read it. But anyway, it just was so long ago. But I walk into negotiations, and this is about why when we do our work right, we win and they lose. I walk in, it's the opening of negotiations. We practice opening PowerPoint. All these workers are ready to make this big presentation, and the doors open, and in walks the management side for the first time. And it had been a blood-curdling fight to get them there, by the way. They were suing us and said we cheated in the election and all the lies that they like to tell. So we finally get negotiations going. And the chief negotiator from Fox and Rothschild's big firm, management side law firm, trying to imitate him. He's big, tall guy. And he walks in and he's got, all these stacks of paper. And the one aimed right at us is my book facing us, tabbed all over it. right? So poker face is tested right away. I'm like, oh my God, I forgot I wrote a book and this idiot just read the whole thing. So he knows everything I'm going to do in these negotiations, right? So he comes in and he gets to the table and the management team is sitting down and he picks up my book and he said, so far, it's just like your book says. There's really a lot of workers here and there's a big screen. I bet you're going to have workers do a presentation, aren't you? At which point I can't decide where this is going to go, but I said, exactly right. So glad you studied. I just kept poker face and told him how good it was that he studied. And I said I'd read a lot about Fox and Rothschild too and kept a straight face, and off we went. When we took the first caucus and they left after the big worker presentation and getting the proposals from us, I had to ask everyone to wait to make sure that management was down the hall a little ways. And the room just erupted. And for the rest of the negotiations, the joke was, well, the idiot could read every word of every page and obviously has no idea what he's doing no matter what, because we're going to beat him anyway. That's the point. It doesn't matter if they know what we're going to do. Our job is to organize the workers to a credible strike threat and bring the community in. And if we can do those two things, we stand a really good chance of winning much better contracts than we're used to winning. And now when I go into negotiations, I have several books out. It's like how much it's not about the words on the page. It's about, can you rebuild worker power in a way that's going to change the situation. So yeah, it was kind of a funny moment though in my life.
Jane, I have a question. What are some tips workers can use to overcome retaliation during campaigns or during actions?
Yeah, great question, because there's plenty of it, right? Plenty of retaliation out there. So the first is that's another reason that I like to talk about doing structure tests and seeing how quickly we can get to majorities, because the sooner we can build a simple majority, like a 55%, majority in a shop, the sooner we can actively build really good protections around activists that we have in the shop. But it's also an argument for why, if you've got even one unit where people are unified already, part of bringing the faith leaders into the campaign is that they're also the best fact checkers next to worker power, right? Next to unity, next to an approach to retaliation that goes like this. Let's say someone is harassed, sent home, worst case in our world that happens is fired. But, just daily retaliation, their schedules change, their shift is changed, their vacation is suddenly changed because suddenly the boss sees them getting really involved in their own organization. I like to start right there with a little petition that's going to go right at that workplace that says, so-and-so, John, Jose, Maria, whoever it was beginning to pass a contract survey, or she wore her button standing up for greater wages or better safety. And here's what management did to him or her. I support the immediate, whatever it is, whatever we would put in a grievance demand, I'm going to put it on a real short petition and use that to start building that one shop right away. Because the only way to stop the fear from spreading is to expose management and beat them at it by presenting a petition from, let's say it's a store with 50 people, 40 people, even if it's small, if you get a majority of them saying, we don't care what the boss says about this worker, we support their right to take action in the contract campaign or take action in defense of their coworkers if they're handling a grievance or something like that, whatever it is. I'm going to quickly call a meeting with that worker and other workers around them. Hopefully we have the leaders on board, because that's where it's going to matter, to immediately then get the leaders to get everyone to sign, even again, in a small store, a petition like that. And we might be filing a grievance, and we might be doing an unfair labor practice, and we might be doing all those concurrent things at the same time. I like to cover my bases, right? So if a boss is harassing a worker who's getting active in their organization, we might record an unfair labor practice. We might be filing against some discrimination or harassment clause in the contract. But the most important thing we have to do to stop a bad manager is to teach them a lesson by getting the coworkers to say that they stand united with that worker. And then suddenly all of them are, that's a simpler ask, right? Like than a strike vote. It's like, I support my coworkers' right to demand better safety or a better shift or whatever it is they're doing, or rep, a fellow worker in the store. I think that, again, going towards transparency, the more we use the organizing approach to resolve worksite problems, and not grievance articles, in the contract, the stronger the shop is going to be. And these things are not, it isn't like we just walk out the door and do them all at once tomorrow, though that helps. But we know it takes a little while to get there. But that's my best approach to retaliation. And then once we've done the community mapping and we have their own faith and elected and local community leaders involved, that really helps with even bigger retaliation that can often come down the road as we're getting ready for a strike or something, right? So that's my best approach to how do we deal with retaliation. Go right at it.
That's great. Anything else?
We're ready to go?
Jen, do we have anything on the chat? We have a discombobulated head out there.
We do?
Yep.
I don't know. Because I don't know this program. Oh, there we go. I can chat.
Evan was a discomfort.
Let me go near the end. Oh, okay. Now I can see.
Oh, disembodied.
Oh, I've got one unless someone else has one. I see them now.
Oh, yeah, you can see the chat, Jamie. You can go ahead and read them off if you see some there.
I see one about how we can become better advocates for workers with disabilities. And I think that is just like the petition that I just described, which is the best way to be, supportive of people who have disabilities is to have an open conversation with coworkers about that. And if there's been, if someone's getting degraded by the employer because they have some kind of disability, doing a petition and going right at it is going to be a similar approach. And it's going to let us do small p political education with our own members, because maybe some members are themselves not being great around some workers, some coworkers or workers, physical or other disabilities. And, I've never in a circumstance like that said to a worker who's maybe being less supportive, if it's worker on worker challenge, can you think of anybody that or in your family who's ever had a disability before? Because there's not a family that I've met that can't say yes to that question. And so how we bring our own folks along and then make sure we're training our energy on the boss, that to me is really fundamental. And the whole United States is not very good on this topic, by the way. Now that I work in a lot of other countries, I'm shocked at how, I guess I'm not, but I'm embarrassed about how behind the United States is on questions of workers' rights when they have physical or other disabilities. We're just pathetic on it. So winning good language in our contracts would be a nice public contribution to public policy. And then, having workers speak up because they're afraid management is going to retaliate. I mean, that's back to that question. The minute you can do a supermajority petition in any of the work sites individually, the faster everyone's going to start to step up. And it's why I love majority petitions, because when we show the boss, not tell them, show them, everyone here supporting Lulu or whoever it is, the boss is going to have to think differently about retaliation, because now they're going to realize everyone here, I'm going up against most of the workers in my store if I'm a local manager. Probably not such a smart idea. And maybe, by the way, if it's really bad retaliation, maybe it is that the signature lines on a simple petition that we're asking members of that store to sign is actually a ULP form, just a simple, we're asking you to sign on to this unfair labor practice charge that we may file against the employer. It lets us explain what a ULP is to our members, which is a good thing to explain to members too. In hard fights, we make like little notebooks, that you can fit in your back pocket called, ULP notebooks. And we just teach workers to whip them out, little spiral bound notebooks. It has the local, in that case, it was Nevada 1107, whatever. We put the local's name on it, put the work site, give them out to everyone, it explains the thing you want to do if the manager is coming to bug you is to say, sorry, for the unfair labor practice petition that we're filling in right now, it would be helpful for me if you could spell your first and last name for me. That's the best thing to say to a manager who's harassing a bunch of workers. I'm sorry, I'm trying to fill in this unfair labor practice charge against you, so it'd be better if I spelled your name correctly. I've never had managers turn around and walk away as fast as when they get that question from a lot of people. And it's a good thing to train the worker. I mean, we've just had to train thousands of workers to do that because we're usually in blood-curdling wars, in these contract fights. So, and I'm sure that's not something that is not familiar to you. I'm sure it is. But I love to ask them to spend it down. Our manager has an extensive friend and church hiring program. Oh, how interesting. I'm looking at Thomas's comment about our manager has an extensive friend and church hiring program in our store. None of them are pro-union, luckily. We're journey heavy for now. Okay, that's great. So going back to faith, by the way, like honestly, if we don't, look at that, fancy. If we don't go, if the members themselves aren't the ones who go to ask their faith leaders for support, it's not going to work. And that's because it's fascinating to me, right, that you've got a manager who's close to some church hiring program. We've definitely had that. I'll say in the nursing home and childcare industry, it's very common. And we wind up reorienting those relationships when management is exposed by members of the same faith to the kind of shenanigans that they're pulling off in the work site. So that's delicate work. And I would probably figure out how to draw a ring around that one and start doing the faith-based work at other shops than the one where the guy is or gal is close to a faith leader. But we've upended the worker approach to the community mapping that's done by workers, and that workers then engage in themselves at the appropriate point in the contract fight when their expectations are raised, like, wow, we're going to try and really go for it and win here. It really, I have a critique in probably all of the books that it's really not going to be possible for a hired full-time staff person at some labor community coalition that 5 unions put together. Like that person's never going to be as effective as members connected to their own church or their own faith or their own synagogue or their own parent-teacher association or their own school. No one's going to be able to move either an undecided faith leader or even an anti-faith leader like a member of their parish. And that's real, and it's why it's an organizing task. I mean, we've educated and moved a lot of powerful faith leaders in my lifetime, and I don't practice a faith, but I've spent a lot of time in houses of faith with members over the years, and we've really moved a lot of powerful leaders over into support, away from employers who they think of as creating jobs, over to the worker side because the workers themselves do it. Then we can go back in and mobilize them. Then I can go sit in an hour of power session on Wednesday once our member has already moved the big power leader in town. Then it's okay for me to show up with them and have a harder conversation, with the member with their faith leader or members. And we're just doing this. I just want to say right now to give you a vision of this. We're doing this right now with my old local. And I'm mindful of the time here, but we started a minute or two late. But I'm doing this right now with my old home local, 1199 New England. And we just pulled 157 rank and file workers out of the shops for a week, out of long-term care, group homes, and nursing homes for a week using union leave language in the contract. And then put 40 organizers with them. And I led a 7-day blitz where we had 200, again, overwhelmingly just rank and file workers from the shops, and then a handful of staff go out and have a conversation with several thousand workers to map their community for a giant contract fight that they are heading into. And it was beautiful to watch in particular, to watch the 157 rank and file worker leaders go from like, what are you teaching me? What's the 6-step organizing conversation at a big training day on day 1 of their union leave? To day 2, when they all went out to begin by turf, talking to their coworkers and getting some information about, well, the community connections, like second day on the doors, doing door knocking, house calling, and going into work sites where we had good access language. Members having incredible conversations about what it would mean to bring their community connections into the contract fight. And then by the 3rd day of members, 157 rank and file members being on the doors with this form, doing this community mapping project, everything changed. And now I'm working with the union and sorting through 1,429 connections to houses of faith just from that 1-week blitz, and mapping them by political precinct, by state senator, by state assembly person, and just starting to get the members ready to go ask for letters. But imagine that kind of those numbers, right? Like it's untapped power that we leave on the table all the time. And when we leave it, we'll have like a manager using it against us instead of workers using power on the table. I don't like to go into any contract fight leaving an ounce of power on the table. So the community part is the part that we really don't address well as a trade union movement either. And when we do, it brings more power to the fight. So I feel like we need all the power we can get going into every contract fight we have, or break up a merger fight, or whatever it is we're doing. Having been sent in to blow the largest hospital merger in the United States, I have strong feelings about those mergers too. But anyway, yeah, I know we're out of your time. So
Yeah.
Good.
This is great, Jane. And,
All right.
everyone attending will get a copy of Rules to Win By. Some of them couldn't wait. I saw them, they went online and ordered them already. So let us know if you do want a copy or don't want a copy, but we plan to give them out to everyone. And thank you so much.
Such a pleasure. Yeah. Such a pleasure. Really great to be here. Super nice to actually see you this time, and all of you. And I'm really excited about the work that you're doing, and I look forward to hearing about it as you progress forward. Yeah, we'll stay in touch. Sounds good. All right. Thank you. Take Jane. Care. I don't know how to get out of here. You're never in your
You will not be able to stay home, brother.